Hello, Jess Pettitt. How are you?
I'm excellent. I'm so sorry. I was listening and I totally wasn't listening.
It's
Um,
because I was such an engaging host that you were lost in the show.
well, what's funny is I was waiting for the record thing to go, but it's all teeny tiny over there. Okay, I'm so sorry. Do you want to
No,
start
that's
over?
okay. I'm 100% not redoing that or cutting it out or keeping this real. I literally, the last thing I said before I hit record was, this is pre recorded, so if we make a mistake, we can always edit, but it's much more fun not to, so.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yes. Hi. Uh,
I love it because it almost ties into the topic of what we're going to talk about in terms of being imperfect and moving forward. So before we get into that, welcome to my podcast, Jess. And you know what? For people who don't know you and haven't read the show notes in advance or haven't read your book, I like to kick things off by just giving you sort of the opportunity to share the 1 minute, which is very hard for most people, especially speakers, but sort of the 1 minute about Jess, kind of, especially what you're up to these days. We don't need to go in the whole bio; that'll kind of come out. But just tell listeners a little bit about yourself and kind of what you're working on.
yeah. So I am also a speaker who does focus on DEI, and I bring comedy to the most controversial topics and our own personal failures, largely because I think that will motivate us to keep doing good. That's who I am. And I
Fantastic,
like cheese.
and even though it's a pretty hot topic for people who don't know what DEI is, could you just define that?
Absolutely. It's a good setup for doing that exact same thing. So the letters typically stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the way that I like to look at it is recognizing problems that you may not experience, but that doesn't mean that they're not problems for someone else. Being able to be prepared for whatever could potentially happen, and then knowing the difference between a reaction and a response, doing something more informed. That's how I look at DEI.
Okay, fantastic. And so you've written a couple books, and we are one of the reasons we are chatting is you just came out with your new one called Almost Doing Good, which I'm holding up if you're watching the video. If not, it's called Almost, and you can see it in Jess's background as well. And before we get into that, though, you had this is a new book, but you've been in this space for gosh, how long?
400 million years, I think. So
Well,
I
you look
started
fabulous for that age, but
thank you. It's a cream. Um, I started my business officially in 2005, so it has been 19 years.
that's awesome. And this is not a I don't know how to say it. It's not an easy space to speak in, I would assume. And one of the things I think, one of the reasons you've been successful, and you've mentioned this before, is you're willing to just go in and kind of say the things to people that they need to hear and talk about the hard subjects without kind of dancing around them. So, how did you get started in this? Like, what kind of made you jump into this field?
Well, interestingly, is when I kind of bumbled my way into doing stand-up comedy when I was living in New York, but I was working full-time at NYU. And these two things seem very disconnected, but I think it gave me the opportunity to see how connected they really were.
Mm-hmm.
And what I believe I have done now, or at least my approach, right, is that when we look at current events or what has happened in the news in the last 24 hours, whichever 24 hours that is,
Mm-hmm.
uh, those are things that we have convinced ourselves are very hard to talk about. But those things that happen have happened before. There's a pattern there
Mm-hmm.
that's happening. And so we have convinced ourselves to not talk across these very controversial topics as I believe an excuse to not have the real conversations with our kids, our partners, our coworkers, or even just total strangers in public. And so what I try to do is turn today and yesterday's current events into kind of a stand-up routine with a point so that we can clear the deck
Mm-hmm.
from the polarizing topics that we like to think are the hard things so that we can realize we already have the skills to actually then have the conversations we need to have with the people in our own lives. So ultimately, it's about relationships and connections and feeling like a sense of belonging and helping someone else feel like they belong. But I didn't leave the humor behind because I think it's one, probably the best differentiator I have, and
Mm-hmm.
two, humor is a great equalizer. So then, regardless of people's politics or experience in an audience, we all like to laugh. So then now we have this thing in common and we can build up and back down from there.
Yeah, I can only imagine too with a topic like, I mean, I get it right from my humor background as well. I get we want to talk about change, but the humor is a huge benefit.
Mhm.
But I can only imagine for your topics, like it's such a differentiator, right? It's such a hard thing to. There's such a gray area about are you able to joke about it? Like, how do you navigate that? Like tying humor to topics that some people might think are sensitive or offensive.
I mean, ultimately, again, it's the language I use is it's the same skill set,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like if I think of someone that I have pretty strong political disagreements with, if I enter that conversation trying to win or be right or make them lose and make them wrong, I'm not engaging in a conversation. I am lobbing fact weapons at them, and
Yeah.
I am probably receiving fact weapons from them. That's not a connection, right? And so, can I listen in a way where I'm really prioritizing the connection with this human being instead of fact weapons? And we do it all the time, right? Like, so I typically open my keynotes with, are any of you frustrated by any human being or topic right now? And it gets this huge laugh because, of course, we all are.
Mm-hmm.
And then, have you ever had a conversation that you cared about that even when it goes AWOL, you yes and the conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I can take your words from you. So I care so much about this person, I care so much about this topic that I don't know where we're going, but I'm in it. I'm not leaving. And if you have the skills to not leave even though you don't know where you're going, but you also have the experience of like, nah, I'm not using those skills right now, then all I'm asking us is to become more conscious of when we choose to or choose not to use the skills we already have, which to me is being responsible for yourself and becoming more conscious of what you're unconscious of.
Hmm.
That's
I love that. I love you brought the essay because as soon as you were talking about like lobbing the logic bombs and the argument bombs, I'm like, that's what I talk about with the basically saying you're saying yes but to people, which is hey, let me tell you my point of view and why I'm right versus the yes and it's funny my assistant. We talk about marketing and whatnot. She's been throwing this at me for a while. She's like, DEI is a topic you should speak on. Like, it's the yes and. I see a big need for it. I'm like, I don't feel comfortable talking about it. Like, I can see how yes and fits into that, but doing the things that you do, I'm like, it's not my area of expertise. I'm gonna kind of stay in my lane. But even before you came out with your book, when I first started having ideas about doing a podcast, I made my list of guests, and you were on that list because I'm like, I see this tying into a lot of the messages I hear Jess saying. And before I get into the book, which is great, and I got way too many questions to ask about it, I do want to ask you the reason I was going to reach out to you is through all my years attending conventions, the National Speakers Association, and seeing speakers, there's a few times over the years that a speaker has said something from the stage that line has resonated in my head and stayed with me where I still think about it and apply it. And you fall into that category, and you probably know what
wow.
I'm going to say because I'm sure you've heard this before. Is you did a 5 minute presentation. It was like a quick thing that 5 speakers, and you talked about how, like, you came out dressed, in sparkly things, and you're like, you probably all made a judgment about me, and she's like, and you were like, that's fine. I'm not telling you you're wrong for doing it. Well, I'll do it, but just like we all print a document about people, and I'm saying you can do that. Just leave room for edits. And I thought
Mhm.
that was one of the most powerful things because, and you do this throughout the book, you do this in everything we've talked about. You never make the other person wrong for their initial thought process.
Mhm.
And I thought that was so powerful because so many times I feel like we've heard the message like, don't judge people, be kind. So just before we get into the book, I did want to just ask you if you could share a little bit about what that idea was about and how that maybe permeates your work, this idea of make room for edits.
I think that ultimately the if we pull the curtain back, right, what permeates my work is first an invitation for people to come in instead of have to like qualify to be involved. I really try to be an invitation in,
Mm-hmm.
um, because so many people feel judged and disqualified to engage in a conversation. Some of that is self-motivated, and some of that is lived experience of where they weren't like cool enough or good enough or whatever, good enough, that's just how that came out, right?
Yep.
So the invitation piece, I believe we make judgments and assumptions so that we feel safe and so we feel prepared. And everyone's life has taught them what they do, and that's how they've come up with the definition of what it actually feels like to be safe and prepared. And so to discredit what someone else needs, who am I to do that? Not I'm not by any means a religious person, so I'm not saying that like judgment is reserved for one person, the sky daddy or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. But I need to know, can I cuss in this room? Can I not cuss in this room? Is this outfit okay? Is this outfit not okay? Which jokes are gonna work? Which jokes aren't gonna work? And I mean, doing stand up is all about riding that risk line of reading the audience in the given moment. So being prepared and feeling safe is deeply rooted in your own lived experience of when you were not prepared and you did not feel safe. That doesn't mean you're accurate. It just means you've done what you've needed to do to feel safer or more prepared in a given space. But that doesn't mean that what you have done accurately reflects the other person or the situation or the room. There are times that I read a room to be far more conservative than they really were, and I probably could have done some more risky things. But I didn't read that, right? I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
right. So part of leave room for edits is the generosity and the appreciation you have. I'm a big writer. When you give a draft to someone else, you're so grateful for their edits and their feedback. I like to say that I spend money to get away from my head, right? I'm never going to buy me. I'm never going to be in my audience. I
Mm-hmm.
desperately need those edits from the outside to find out how this is landing out there. So, can I extend that space of curiosity, generosity, vulnerability, authenticity to other people? And I think that's where leave room for edits comes in when we're talking about judgments and assumptions.
I love it. I think it's just such a powerful way of, and it's so simple and it's so inclusive. Like it's awesome. So speaking of inclusivity, then, um, let's kind of take it to the point you're at now. So you had a book earlier, which was Good Enough Now, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So now you've come up with sort of the sequel or extension or whatever you want to call it. Or the next book maybe it's completely different. I don't remember. But it's
I,
almost
I
doing
I
good.
call it the prequel. Actually, I'm doing it Star Wars style. So I wrote
Oh,
them out of order, but this is the prequel.
got it. So this like lays some of the foundation that then leads into. All right, perfect. So, for the listener, then, could you kind of give us the overview of what this book is all about?
Sure. So if we're doing it in the wrong order, so I wrote Good Enough Now primarily for an individual to be able to reflect on their own life and kind of decide how their life taught them who and how to be. And is there a gap between what your life taught you and what you were choosing who and how to be in the world? Basically, that's what Good Enough Now means, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that was the premise. And the motivation of writing that book came from people in my life who I'm grateful for their, challenging me, their friendship, their mentorship, etc. And I realized not everybody has access to people who are willing to work with you one on one to self reflect and decide who you want to be in this world. So I wrote the book. Great. So in the 10 years or so that has happened since I wrote the first book, I have, but the clientele that I work with has gotten much more corporate and working with leadership of organizations. Simultaneously, I'm watching how inside the United States, we have corporatized or capitalized on this human rights being given to organizations. So I'm kind of calling the bluff on organizations having human rights, corporate social responsibility programs, things like that. So the prequel to Good Enough Now is that the organizational clients that I have, organizational leadership, they should be able to answer these same questions as an organization that is incredibly well resourced. So, not necessarily like the CEO as an individual, although I have a book for that, but if we're going to give human rights to the organization should be able to give voice of what its belief and values are what's its ideal workplace culture, and close the gap between what they think it is and what people are actually experiencing. So I wrote Almost Doing Good largely out of the frustration of working with these very well-resourced organizations. What I realized is that they're too scared to go first, and they're overly confident that they are not doing things the worst, right? So
Yeah.
they know they're not in last place, but they're too chicken to go first. And there's no momentum there. It's a way to freeze. And so I took all of my clients' failures, and I want to honor the good intentions and that those failures are in the right direction. Now
Mm-hmm.
let's keep going to try to build the momentum that's needed to almost do good so that our organization or individual leadership could be good enough. See how it,
Yeah, and I wrote that line down. It was one of the first things I wrote down was organizations have fear of being first, but just don't want to be the last, and then sort of, and it's kind of easy to live in that space, but like, all right, well, I'm not going to take the initiative, and as long as we're not doing it worse than anyone else, we don't need to worry about it, or we can deal with it
right.
later. Um,
Somebody's always doing worse than me, so I don't need to do anything.
yeah,
No.
and along someone's always doing worse than me, and what I love is early on you talk about your 5 assumptions, and the first assumption is at best we're already doing the second best thing, and
Right.
no one is doing the best thing.
Right.
Which I think is a powerful statement, but I think it's probably worth digging into a little bit. So could you kind of explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's a prophecy that I think I first heard it on a in a fortune cookie. That the best time to plant a tree is 300 years ago. The second best is today.
Mm-hmm.
The third best is tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Fourth best is like your next day off, right? Like, but that I don't want you to lose the premise of the importance of planting a tree just because of how your calendar works.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you can quantum leap yourself, I don't know that we can go back 300 years to plant a tree, but that doesn't mean you should never plant a tree.
Yeah.
And so I'm even with Good Enough Now, I got a lot of pushback, and I get a lot of pushback on Almost, is that there's so much specifically in US culture, I think, that is exceptionalism, and you must be the first, number one, biggest, fastest growing, blah, blah, blah,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And to me, that's got a lot of colonialism in it, but it also has the ability to be too late to try.
Yeah.
It's really working for a lot of organizations that have a ton of resources that really could do good work. And so, can I give them permission to shoot for second best instead of using best as the excuse to not try?
And that's one of the things that probably jumped out at me right away because it is such an improv comedy idea of I do the same thing. It's like, look, if you wait to have it all figured out before you even take the first step, like no one's gonna ever figure it out. In improv, it's about, well, let's take a step. How did it work? All right, let's take the next step. Now in improv, you're doing it in a matter of seconds. It's like you say one thing, you say the next thing.
Right.
And to me, that statement and essentially the whole approach, it seems, in your book is very much about like what's like, don't wait till it's perfect. Like, do something.
Right.
But then learn from it. Don't like just pick a strategy out of the gate and say this is what we're going to stick with, but kind of iteratively learn, improve, and keep getting better and better. Is
Right.
that fair to say?
Totally. I mean, it's funny when we talk about improv. So I did stand up, not improv. And when I tried to do improv, I failed miserably at doing improv because largely I do not trust the bit. I don't
Mm-hmm.
trust other people. I don't trust the space. And so I have this horrible memory of really having conjured up an idea of where a scene or a bit was going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And the second person said the second thing and absolutely did not take it there. And so I was forcing my lines to follow what I wanted to do. And I
Uh-huh.
looked like I was on a different planet, right? Because I wasn't yes-anding, I was yes-anding myself. And like, okay, what's the next thing I could do that could take this garbage and turn it as close to the idea that I originally had? Because I was so
Mm-hmm.
sold that my idea was good.
Yeah, that's why
And
that's the exact example. I'm not you specific. That's the exact example I talk about when I talk about this idea of letting go and being in the moment. Is you get improvisers and they'll get an idea, and the thing their partner responds with is different, and then they get, which kind of brings an interesting point about like context and doing good and almost good, and is like you're obviously very good about taking feedback and being flexible in the moment, and but in this other area, you were bad at it. And I think
So bad.
I think you're gonna see that in probably in the world and in work. There are probably people that are like in one area of their lives are very good at being inclusive and listening. So in their minds, kind of like, well, they're definitely not the worst, right? They're already doing it, but being unaware that how they're operating maybe at home or in their community is different than the persona they're bringing to work. But because they're doing it in one area, they're not even aware that they're sort of not doing it all in this other. Is that something that happens? Is that like a
I just think that's like basic human behavior. And it's our responsibility to notice when we're using the lever and when we're not using the lever. I mean, my partner and I were talking just yesterday, and I was identifying something that I am very impatient about and that I really would like. I really would like to work on patience on this. It's probably related to like politics or something. So who knows what it was. I'm just impatient and I want it to happen immediately. Yeah. Chill out, chill out. So then, in a different conversation context, he was trying to post something on a Medium website that he had written, and he couldn't figure out the technology and it wasn't working, and he didn't know if it was his computer, the actual website platform, or his eyesight, right? And so he was just
mm-hmm,
like, what am I missing here? What is going on? And I was like, I don't know. I'll play. Can I drive? Can I like play around and fiddle with it?
mm-hmm.
And so it ended up being copy and paste, but paste as plain text,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
Like not rocket science. And he's like, the amount of patience you are able to apply to computers is so impressive to me. And so then I was able to say, like, I didn't know if it was going to work. And he's like, right, but you have the overconfidence that you're probably going to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I was able to flip it around that he has a knee injury and he's so overly patient that like his anatomy is going to naturally recover. It drives me nuts because he'll ice his knee for 2 years and then decide maybe he needs to do something else. And to me, that's not patience. That's just like losing track of time,
Mm-hmm.
right? But he really is confident that it'll just kind of fix itself after a period of time. So I think what's important, back to the question, is that patience and impatience are not separate from each other. And it's our responsibility to figure out when we can deploy which one. And in the case of this improv set, what makes it even more ridiculous is that the idea, I so clearly remember how frustrated I was, but I'd come up with an idea that was about a porcupine going to space. And I don't know about you, that's kind of a random idea that I had come up with, but
Mm-hmm.
I was stuck to it and would not move from it. Well, shocking. Whoever I was on stage with at the time did not come up with porcupine in space.
Yeah.
Then I'm not building a bit for the audience's benefit, right? I was like hunkering down, and I think eventually I was like almost triangulating against my partner
Mm-hmm.
between my idea and my humor. And who the hell do you think you are having
Yeah, your
some
partner then instead of being part of the big of an obstacle, like this is a brilliant
right,
idea I have, and you're blocking me from getting it out, and
right. And none of that is entertaining to an audience,
right.
right? And so like that's where I think I fell into my ego more than I was able to be like deploy the humility needed to mutually co-create something.
Mm-hmm.
And I see the same thing in my clients all the time. They're totally cool to co-create until they're not.
Yep.
And what I wanted to do was to be able to articulate the times where not happened, but not might have been the fourth best option. It doesn't mean that it was horrible. Even if it actually caused harm, it could still be the step in the right direction. And
Mm.
those good intentions shouldn't be completely deleted. They could be learned from. So now we're at almost doing good.
Yeah, and I would love to just keep talking about improv, obviously, but I want to make sure we touch upon a few things in your
No,
book because
keep it
I
up.
got a
It's
whole
great.
page. We're not going to get to everything I wrote down about your book because maybe we'll have a second conversation at some point. Uh, Before I get into a few specific questions, though, two quick ones for you. One, who would you say is the ideal reader for this? I think that, like I got stuff out of it, but I'm a solo business, so maybe I'm not the target market for it. So just who's kind of ideally positioned, and then because I don't want to leave it to just the end, for people who do read the book, you had mentioned you're going to do a free book club where people can
Yeah.
actually discuss and get info. So could you just talk about those two things quick, and then I'll go into a few questions about the content in the book itself.
Sure. Oddly, I think that the nimbleness is involved in the answer of who is the book targeted for. So I wrote the book as a therapy project because I was so frustrated of working with my CEOs. And so
Mm-hmm.
I wrote the book for CEO, C-suite leadership of organizations. If I want to be really specific of that avatar, I feel like there is a vortex happening between B Corps and really fast growing organizations where the founders still work
Mm-hmm.
that are proposing that they care about the planet in some way, right? Like to be a registered B Corp means that you've gone through these extra steps to share, that you have some obligation to stakeholders greater than yourself. When the founders still work there, when they go from 8 employees to 18,000 employees in a couple years, there's going to be a gap
Yeah.
between how you think this organization is working and how people are actually experiencing it. And I believe that gap is impacting their ability to do good out with stakeholders, right? Like that is who I wrote the book for. Who is benefiting from the book seems to be human beings,
Yeah.
which is a fascinating thing I didn't really expect. But as the book released October 8th, and the number of people who are actually reading the book is a little stunning to me.
Mm-hmm.
And people that I would never have anticipated enjoying the process of reading the book. I try really hard to balance hard, thoughtful concepts and topics with funny stories and illustrations and humanize the difficulty of this stuff, and that I'm normalizing the complexity of it, and that it's disruptive of even what other DEI people are thinking about DEI. And I love that. Like, that's exactly kind of who and how I want to be in the world. The book discussion that you mentioned, and thank you for mentioning it. I want to do a series of free book discussions because I want to be able to see what people outside of my cranium think
Mm-hmm.
about the book. So almostdoinggood.com is kind of the website that'll have more information about those series. The first one is in December, and the idea is to have as many people from as many different industries or experiences, or you and I are solopreneurs. If we read the book together and discuss together what resonates, I can't know what's going to be interesting to other people, but I need to be open to it. So I can't do it on an improv stage, but I can do it in a book discussion.
That's perfect. And for I'll put the link in the show notes and on the website and everything. But
Perfect.
is there a place you can send people for the book club, or is it one of those long convoluted?
I turned it into a bit.ly, but it's still weird to say out loud. But the first version starts December 6th, and you can register through like a Zoom webinar. You can register at bit.ly is bit.ly
Mm-hmm.
/ 3XIQKHM.
Okay, well,
Very
if you're
helpful.
only listening, then that's where you go. But I will put the link in the notes so people
Yeah.
can get this one.
And
And the
there'll
best
be
place to get your book.
yeah, there'll be information as well at almostdoinggood.com. And you can buy the book at bookstores, Amazon, Kindle, and the audiobook will be out in January. So I'm trying to make it as accessible as possible.
Awesome. Well, then I do want to go into the book a little bit to kind of whet people's
Yeah.
appetite. I want people to read it because this book, it's packed. It's not like overly long, and you had mentioned how long original draft was. But I was impressed because I feel like so many books I read. I don't read a lot of books on this topic, but so many books I read are just filled with, I don't know, like rambling ideas, theory, um, excessive numbers of stories. And this one, like, it's got like this perfect balance of like case studies, but here's what you do. There's step by step. Here's what you do. So there's too much. That's why there's too much for me to talk about. So I just want to hit on kind of the high level stuff. The first thing that I really like in terms of step by step is for responding and for dealing with this sort of thing, you have a three-step, like basically three categories of things to do: prepare, recognize, respond, which sort of is how you frame the structure of the book. So could you just touch upon like what those three kind of phases are in this process?
Sure. If we stick with the normalizing complexity disruption thing,
Mm-hmm.
probably the most accessible way that I can describe something that I think is often academically made to be so complicated it's intimidating,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I am deploying a three-seated bicycle. And the reason why I think that's important is one, in comedy, rules of three.
Of
Everything
course.
happens in threes anyway. But what I think is important here is that I will tell you my take on prepare, recognize, and respond. But I want to make sure that our default to a linear model that like you have to start at prepare
Mm-hmm.
is not what I mean, because you have to do all three of them at the same time. I don't care which one you start with. One of them's probably going to be more comfortable. You might even be better at one of them and worse at the other. But like a three-seated bicycle, you need all of them to really maintain momentum going in the right place. And the patterns of the failed case studies is that really one was used to like come up with an idea of some kind of new initiative to do, and it flopped because it didn't use the other two, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I find preparation is where a lot of people are very comfortable because it's about looking at bylaws or policies and procedures or creating a way of doing things, and it's documented, but you don't actually have to do it. You just have to discuss how you would do it, which
Mm-hmm.
can often land very hypocritical. I think about leaders that I've worked with who've been, like, Avish, if you have any complaints, like I have an open door policy, feel free to come to my office.
Mm-hmm.
So you come to my office and you're like, I have a complaint. And then my response is, feel free to come to open door policy. Feel free to come anytime you want to. I just showed up in your office. Like now you need to do something about it,
Mm-hmm.
right? But like the open door policy is the preparation piece. Um, Recognition, I think, is actually the one that I'm the worst at. Some people might be better at this than me, but it's the idea of recognizing a problem I don't experience. And part of that is
Mm-hmm.
listening, like you don't know the answers, trusting other people, getting my own ambiguity and anxiety out of the way, and being able to hear someone else's experience that is wildly different than mine as valid. Like, what does
Mm-hmm.
that mean? And then doing my own work to like get out of my own way. That's no one else's responsibility. Some people are very good at their own like therapy and self-reflection work and journaling and like focus groups and all of those kind of
Mm-hmm.
things, but it still doesn't act and it still doesn't apply. So recognition is that middle piece. And then the last one is really understanding the difference between a reaction and a response. And frankly, most of the case studies are very quick reactions. And so when
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of categorizing them, I was like, okay, yes, they kind of all fit in to this knee-jerk reaction, but like, can I focus in on the elements that are in recognition or in preparation to really honor the good intentions there? But it didn't necessarily land as a solid response, deeply rooted in the organization's workplace culture and its impact to its greater stakeholders, which is what response would be.
Got it. And you, you say all three are important, but that one seems to be an off a knee jerk reaction. Would you say in your work with so many clients over the years that that's the one that people struggle with the most, or is it a pretty even distribution of people kind of?
Oh, people are collectively a mess. I don't think I don't know anybody. This really actually angers a lot of people when I say this. So there's your trigger warning. But
Excellent.
I don't know an organization that is consistently doing DEI work well
Hmm.
at all. I can't think of one. I can think of a couple that kind of had like a one-off, like that worked, but then they canceled the program or they screwed up something in a different category fairly soon after. So they're all pretty terrible. The example that I use the most is after George Floyd was murdered, there was a huge amount of pressure to put a statement on your website. And so people would start calling me like, I need a statement. I need a statement.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they needed a statement because somebody else had a statement and they didn't have a statement. Okay, what do you want your statement to say? Oh, I have no idea. Just give me a statement. Okay. Well, if you don't know what your statement says, then isn't there, it increases the likelihood that your statement is going to be hypocritical, because if you don't know what it's going to say, you're not doing anything in your own organization that's in line with the statement.
Mm-hmm.
So the statement itself is this new thing that is a reaction that you feel peer pressure to get, right? So you're recognizing the need to have some statement that you have no idea how that is relevant or not relevant inside your own organization. And you don't have a template, right? Like, this isn't the first person who's been murdered by police and is it your job. Let's parallel it to March of 2020 when COVID struck. Every item you have ever purchased in your entire life sent you an email to tell you that they were going to be working from home,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it was so weird for the organization to suddenly have to deal with COVID. They felt obligated to do some kind of like marketing communications about it. So then we as consumers got hundreds of emails from like Dyson telling us
Right.
what's going to happen at their company, and like, yeah, thanks, samesies over here, Dyson. Right? So like that reaction kind of happened to be super clear about what was happening, and nobody was prepared for the pandemic. So it fumbled more, right? So then how do we learn from the fumbles, see the good intentions in the fumbles, and then fumble less? We're not shooting for a touchdown. We're shooting for, I cannot believe I'm using sports metaphors. We're shooting to be able to hang on to something.
Mm-hmm.
And often the leaders that I work with, they think that that's something they're supposed to be hanging on to is going to be provided externally. And I have to be like, hi, you created this business.
Mm-hmm.
It's not coming externally. It's actually you. You're the person that people are looking to tell them what is the point. Um, so
Right.
my job is to bridge the gap.
And it's a powerful thing to say that like no one is doing it right, because there probably are a lot of companies that pride themselves on how good they're doing. What do you think that is, especially when you say that like they do it well in one initiative and then it sort of fumbles again? Why do you think it is so hard for why is everyone doing it poorly?
Um, I think I think it's very sexy to assume that you're doing a really great job. You know, I use a lot of examples in the book from kind of the last client I worked with that I then was compelled to write this book. They won global awards for being the most inclusive place to work. And if you were a secular, liberal, white person, it is a fantastic place to work. Fantastically. But if you were religious, it wasn't. If you were a person of color, it wasn't. If you're conservative, it wasn't. If you're homophobic, it wasn't. If you're transphobic, it wasn't. But if you were cool with gay, lesbian, trans people, you had liberal politics, and you weren't a religious person, and you were white and probably neurotypical and able bodied, it was a fantastic place to work. And those people all felt very entitled to have this fantastic place to work. So I got called in because something was on an internal Slack channel. The company had grown so quickly that they hadn't turned off the all employees channel
Mm-hmm.
inside Slack. So when you're, slacking 8 people versus 80,000 people across 11 time zones, that's a very different access point, right?
Yeah.
So somebody responded to something during Pride Month and just said, I think this should be in the channel that you opt into to find out about Pride Month. And because it was so counterculture to not love everything about Pride Month, it enfuegoed everybody. And the CEO eventually told me that that Slack post cost more in productivity than COVID did
Wow.
because they didn't know what to do. It took them 17 hours leadership to figure out how to log into Slack to determine what to do or what to say to this. So they ended up hiring me. I ended up doing all these focus groups and one-on-one conversations, and that's where I had to tell people, like, your evangelical Christian employees do not feel like they can bring their whole self to work, right? Their Jewish, Muslims, employees do not feel like they can bring their whole self to work. But because the leadership looked like themselves and their motto was bring your whole self to work, they didn't even realize who they were marginalizing, even though they're winning awards for these often oppressed groups, specifically gay, lesbian, trans, and neurodiverse people working in this field. They're winning global awards for this, but they were leaving behind all of these people. And so when I challenged the leadership about it, they're like, oh, well, we didn't hire any of those people. And I was like, I just interviewed 280 people out of your 80,000 employees. That's not even a good random sample, and it is
Mm-hmm.
a pattern that shows up. So you can do good and don't stop doing the good, but also recognize that you are likely not doing perfectly great 100% of the time.
All right, well that's fascinating, and I gotta. We're coming to the end of our time, and so I want to respect that. But I'm gonna ask you a question that maybe can't be answered in the time we have left. But I think you said something that was I think very important. Because yeah, normally I would say stereotypically when we think of DEI, we think of progressive, liberal, inclusive of LGBTQ and but you're saying that the homophobes don't feel welcome and the evangelical Christians don't feel welcome, which is when I stop and think about it logically incredibly valid, but from a DI perspective almost sounds antithetical. Like, well, wait, we need to be inclusive of homophobes, like we need to be inclusive of people who maybe aren't. So I'm sure that comes up with you a lot. So how do
Right.
you all right, I don't have time, so all right, I had another question, but all right, so how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it does come up all the time, and I have to say that regardless of what side of an argument or a lot of this has been politicized, if the first step of inclusion is who are you intentionally excluding? And specifically, as a pinko commie liberal, that makes my head explode. I'm not excluding anyone. Well, is
Mm-hmm.
that true?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who are you instantly voting off the island? Because if your goal is inclusion, you don't get to kick anybody off and call it inclusion. And so, can we use the skills that we have learned in DEI and apply them to people that we disagree with? Now, I get challenged on this because people might say that, like, well, the disagreement is about acknowledging myself as a human. Well, how are they ever going to start acknowledging you as a human if you are hitting them with the same weapons
Mm-hmm.
and weaponized language that they're hitting you with? Right? Like, that's not helping, and probably it's somebody's making money off of it. So I know we're running out of time. We're gonna have to do a part two, but coexistence shouldn't be a goal. It's already happening. The goal is for us to catch up to the fact that we are coexisting with one another. But
Mm-hmm.
instead, we feel superior or make somebody feel inferior so that we can feel better about ourselves. And I think that's not good.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly difficult place to get, but it's so powerful. I respect your work with that. All right, I'm going to finish up in a second. I'm going to ask you one final kind of question. Before that, I'm going to give you a chance to kind of reshare how people should find out and connect with you, get your book, whatnot. But one thing I was going to ask you about, but I won't, but I will say it because it'll be food for the thought for the audience that ties into what you just said. One of the things that really stood out as I was reading it, you said, "Oh, after I speak, a lot of times people will come up to me and talk about them. Like, well, what about them? Why aren't they doing this?" And what you say, your response back to people is you tell people, well, what if you're someone else's them?
Correct.
And I think that ties into this idea of like these people. And so food for thought for you as a listener. If you want to dig more into that, get Jess's book. But when you're thinking about, oh, but what about them? What if you are someone else's them? And it's just a profound shift in thinking.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
thank you very much, Jess. If people, what's that?
I was just going to say it would be lovely if I could change other people's behavior, but I can barely keep track of my own behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it would be lovely. It'd be lovely if they did something different. But I am somebody's they. And so to make that dream come true for somebody else would mean I would need to be responsible for my own behavior
Mm-hmm.
because somebody sees me as they, and then I actually am changing, which gives them the opportunity to possibly change themselves to be more inclusive. So
I love it. Yeah, focus on what you can control. Two quick things. One, let us know where. Remind us where can people find about the book and also about you if they're like, oh, this would be really useful in my company or organization.
sure. Almost Doing Good is the best website for the book. You can get it anywhere books are sold. And then for me, you can go to goodenoughnow.com. Jess Pettitt, most people can't spell my last name, so they all redirect to the same place. And it's a super honor to be here. And I'm so honored that you actually read the book. And I'm like, let's
Oh,
just keep talking. Let's keep
I
talking.
know. I can keep going here. That was a great
Yeah.
book, and it was. I mean, you probably get this as well. It was one that I will admit I wasn't particularly looking forward to reading because when I had the idea in my head, I'm like, oh God, what is she going to tell me I'm doing wrong? But it was so accessible with so many to dos, and as you said, the tone was great. It wasn't like a textbook on RDI. It was like so. Whatever position you're in, I would recommend the book. Check it out. I'll have the link to. I'll post the links to the almost doing good, to Jess's website, to Good Enough Now, and also to the book club,
Book
which is a way
discussion.
of
Yeah.
digging deeper. Final question for you, Jess. I try to end every interview like this. I do what I do because I honestly believe the world would be a better place if everyone just started with a default mindset of saying yes and instead of yes but. You just switch your default, have an open mind. I think the world would be a better place. What is a small thing that you believe would make the world a better place? One small thing that people can do that if everyone just did this, the world would be a better place.
I deeply believe the best thing you could do overall is ask someone a question you genuinely do not know the answer to, because you will learn how to listen like you don't know the answer.
Oh, I love it. So not pretending
Right.
you don't know the answer, but actually ask something you know nothing about to get that
Right.
practice.
Avish, what color socks are you wearing?
I am wearing white socks right
How fascinating.
now.
I did not know that. Right. But I'm not asking you a question I know the answer to.
I love it. So just get in the habit of what it feels like to genuinely not know the answer. I love it. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. Check out Jess's book. Check out Jess's website. Sign up for the book club, and be sure to join us next week. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't yet, and be sure to join us next week for whatever the heck I'm going to talk about because I don't know when that next episode's coming out.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jess. Had a great time, Chad. We'll do it again soon.
Absolutely. Bye.